Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to this tutorial video or series of videos that is going to highlight to you as an e-learning student the importance of conducting a HIRA, or at least developing a HIRA, an HSEMP, your Health, Safety, Environmental Management Plan or Program, as well as your monitoring and measuring, or measuring and monitoring plan/program. Now, you would have covered these three important concepts in your e-learning Samtrack course material, but in order to better prepare you for your upcoming summative assessment that will be performed in one of your chosen NOSA colleges, these series of videos is going to help you to get a better grasp and a better understanding of these three very, very important components to risk management. All right, ladies and gents, you can see the PowerPoint in the video, and I'm going to stay in this current PowerPoint mode. I tell you why, because what I'm going to be doing is just going between slides, moving between slides, going back towards slides, and it's just a little bit easier for me to stay in this presentation mode. All right, so this is an example of a particular case study like paper production. Some of you might one day end up working in a paper mill somewhere around the country or even overseas. Okay, so let's just have a visual idea of what we're looking at here. And there's a typical picture of a massive, very large industrial paper machine that you would find in a typical paper mill. Let's read the case study together. All right, so the activity is we're going to produce paper from logs of wood. To begin the process, logs are passed through a debarker, where the bark is removed, and through chippers, where spinning blades cut the wood into smaller pieces. These wood chips are then pressure cooked with a mixture of water and chemicals in a digester. The pulp is washed, refined, cleaned, and sometimes bleached, then turned into slush in the beater. Color dyes, coatings, and other additives are mixed in, and the pulp slush is pumped onto a moving wire screen. As the pulp travels down the screen, water is drained away and recycled. The resulting crude paper sheet or web is squeezed between large rollers to remove most of the remaining water and to ensure smoothness and uniform thickness. The semi-dry web is then run through heated dry rollers to remove the remaining water. The finished paper is then wound into large rolls, which can be 10 meters wide and weigh close to 120 tons. A slitter cuts the paper into smaller, more manageable rolls, and the paper is then ready to use. Okay, so ladies and gents, when you actually go to the NOSA colleges to write your summative assessment, your exam, in part B of the exam paper, the whole entire part B is actually going to be based on a case study. And it is very, very important that during your exam, you read the case study and get familiar with the case study, because the following questions on from that case study will be your HIRA, your management plan, as well as your measuring and monitoring plan. So it's very, very important, you read the case study. So in your exam paper, you will also be provided with the inputs and outputs. Okay, now you've learned about inputs and outputs way back in your introduction to Samtrack studies. Excuse me, a process map is what we call it. And just as a reminder, why we put together or develop a process map, really, it's one of the many techniques that we risk assessors use, not only to get to know your process that you're assessing by breaking it down into a step-by-step process, but also conducting the process map will provide us with valuable information for the HIRA process. And especially when you take a look at your outputs. Now, those examples there are all hazardous outputs, which is fundamental information to draw into the next phase of the HIRA process, phase 2, which is the identification of your hazards. Remember, process mapping is something that we do at the very early stage of the HIRA process in the planning phase. Your inputs, just as a reminder, your inputs could be any resources, energy, equipment, and or machinery that is needed in order to complete that step or that phase of the process. Always think about the inputs as the things that you need to complete that process or that step of the process. Guys, you can pause the video there and just have a look and familiarize yourself with some of these examples. Now, please just understand, it's not a comprehensive list. It's just some basic inputs and some basic outputs that have been created or needed and created for each step of the paper production process, right from the beginning of the process, debarking, all the way through to the last sort of phase of the process, which is slitting the paper into more manageable rolls. Okay, so pause the video, and you're more than welcome to have a look at some of these inputs and outputs for each of these activities. Now, this example that these videos are based on, I've just randomly selected. I've randomly selected some of these hazardous outputs to draw into my HIRA process. Before we do that, ladies and gents, let's just familiarize ourselves with the 5x5 risk matrix that you would have seen during your studies. Now, when you go to the NOSA colleges to do your exam, you will be provided in your exam pack a 5x5 matrix. This exact one. It will be on an A4 piece of paper. Remember, in industry, when you're doing your risk assessments in the real world, you as a risk assessor will always have access to a matrix. We use matrices simply to evaluate risks. And by evaluating risks, that will give us, risk assessors, an idea as to how we are going to be able to prioritize our risks. And then once we're able to prioritize and identify our most significant risks, then we are able to focus our attention on which risks need to be controlled first. That's the whole idea. Okay, so by now you should be familiar as to how to use the 5x5 matrix. It's based on two parameters, the likelihood of the event and the consequence. Likelihood of the event, also known as probability, also known as frequency. How often is that risk that's been identified in your risk assessment going to result in your identified consequence? A, rare, very, very unlikely going to happen. B, unlikely, it's unlikely going to happen. C, possibly could happen. D, likely, it's likely to happen. E, almost certain, it's very likely to happen. When you are evaluating risks in your industry and you've got access to statistics, risk evaluation for the likelihood of the event actually becomes a bit easier. But in your training environment, in your exam environment, we just got to be reasonably practicable. And to be honest with you, ladies and gents, there's a lot of discretion exercised here because it is subjective. But you'll normally find the more severe the consequence of the risk, like fatalities, disabling injuries, diagnosed occupational diseases, excuse me, these don't tend to happen that often. Whereas your minor injuries, your minor health effects, they tend to happen quite often. So depending on your consequence, you could be looking somewhere on this side of the likelihood of the event, or maybe this side here, but it's subjective. The consequence, how bad? How bad is that consequence? There's the three disciplines: health, safety, the environment. And as you can read it, you're more than welcome to pause the video, read these from number 1, negligible, to worst case scenario, catastrophic. And where the 2 points, the likelihood that you've identified versus the consequence, where the 2 points intersect. So let me just give you an example. Let's say the likelihood of the risk was E, almost certain. And let's say it's a safety consequence, a broken bone, which is a serious disabling injury. So we're looking at E here. 3 for consequence, where the 2 points intersect, that will give us 20H. 20 being the risk level, the risk value, and 20H being the level. High priority, medium priority, low priority. It's all working on the traffic light system: red, top priority, high priority, orange, medium priority, green, low priority. Okay? And really, at the end of the day, any risks in your risk assessment that is red, high priority, are your top risks to control first. And then you work your way through all your medium risks, all the way through until that free risk on your HIRA is now subjected to controls. Okay. Right. So you should be familiar with the 5x5, ladies and gents. But if you do have any questions with regards to either of these videos that you're going to be watching, my name is Nick, and you've probably seen my name on the Samtrack e-learning discussion forums. Please, guys, don't hesitate to pop questions through there. I'm here to help you as much as I can in order to better prepare you for your upcoming summative assessment. Okay. So with that in mind, ladies and gents, let me just go on to the next slide here, just to show you how you can formulate your hazards and your risk with consequence. And what I've done here is I've just randomly selected any 3 activities here that do have potential safety issues. And then I'll do the same for health and do the same for the environment. So you're referencing safety 1, safety 2, safety 3. You're going to utilize the same referencing system in your exams that will be conducted in the NOSA colleges. Safety 1, safety 2, safety 3, however many safety you want to identify. Okay, just follow the question in the exam paper. Your process task, so my first safety is coming from the chipping process, which is this process here, chipping. My second activity is debarking, so that's the first activity. Remember, I just said it's just a random selection. There's debarking. And my third is dry rolling, which is this activity down here. Random selection. All right. My first safety hazard, used sharp blades from the chipping machine that are being removed during maintenance. Okay, so we've got the used, very sharp blades that are coming from the chipping machine that are being removed for maintenance. That is the hazard. I'm going to explain to you a bit later on, ladies and gents, how not to formulate hazards. Okay, you've got to formulate your hazard in sufficient detail and describe it as to why it is a hazard. Remember the definition of a hazard: anything that has the potential to cause harm. My second safety hazard, debark logs poorly stacked outside the debarking section. My third safety hazard is hot steam from the dry rolling machine. All right, so formulate your hazards in sufficient detail so that people in your industry, they are able to extract the information as to why this is in fact a hazard. Remember, going back to your introduction to Samtrack, one of the expectations of the HIRA process, it is consultative, it's auditable. So people need to be able to read what is on your risk assessments. You're not just developing your risk assessments for yourself. People need to be able to read it and understand it. Then we move on to the risk. So for safety 1 here, remember the definition of risk. Risk is the likelihood and or probability that harm from that hazard is going to occur. So my risk here is employees, my employees that are going to handle these sharp blades. That's the risk. And also what you learned in the intro, every risk needs a consequence. So if they're going to handle these sharp blades, what could happen to them? Well, in this example, my consequence is they are going to get cut. So I've got my risk and I've got my consequence. Remember, guys, your risk must have your risk and consequence. If you don't put a consequence, let's just say we said employees handling the sharp blades as the risk. Now that's correct, but it's not completely correct because there's no consequence. And if you're going to leave out a consequence, when it comes to risk evaluation, which is the third stage of the HIRA process, what are you evaluating if you've got no consequence? Okay. And if you just said, use sharp blades from the chipping process or chipping machine, and you just said they're resulting in cuts. Now you've got the consequence, but you've got no risk. Always ask yourself as the risk assessor, okay, so if people are going to get cut, how? How are your people going to get cut? And the answer to that how is your risk. So the risk here is the employees handling, or you could say touching the blades, picking up the blades, mishandling the blades. All these words are describing the risk resulting in cuts. Poorly stacked logs, rolling, contacting employees, coming into contact with those employees, causing crash injuries such as broken bones. So you can see here, I've got my risk. Let me highlight it to you. My risk. And I've got my consequential risk. You need both parameters, guys, risk and consequence. For safety 3, employees contacting hot steam, coming into contact with that hot steam. That's the risk. And when they come into contact with that hot steam, the consequence is resulting in burns. All right. So we need 3 important parameters when you are developing your HIRAs. Parameter number 1, we need your hazard. See that little green tick? We need risk and consequence. Hazard, risk, consequence. Hazard, risk, consequence. Without those 3 parameters, your risk assessments are not going to make sense. And from an assessment point of view, ladies and gents, it's going to cost you marks. And I'll explain that a bit later. All right. You are then also going to be required to evaluate your risks using the methodology, 5x5 matrix, that you will have access to during your exam. So just to very quickly, just to demonstrate what I've done here, for safety 1, my likelihood is E, consequence 2. E, very likely to happen, but these guys are going to handle those blades getting cut. And 2, minor injury that requires medical treatment other than first aid. And where those 2 points intersect, E2, 16 medium. So I'll put on my risk assessment, the value, 16, level, medium priority. For safety 3, my evaluation, D3. Let's have a look, D3. D, likely to happen, 3, serious disabling injury. And the reason why I've chosen a 3 is because if you look at my HIRA, my consequence there is broken bones, which is a serious disabling injury. D3, where those 2 points intersect, D3. Remember, it's safety, so we're evaluating safety. You are not even looking at the health column. Oops, sorry. You're not even looking at the health column. You're not looking at the environmental column. It's strictly safety. Sorry, what did I say here? I said D3. D3, 17H. 17H. My employees contacting that steam resulting in burns, my evaluation, D1. D, very likely to happen, 1, first aid injury. And when the 2 points intersect, that will give me 7 medium. 7 medium. Now, if you just look at these 3 safety risk assessments, remember, ladies and gents, what we said, risk evaluation to identify raw initial risk, it's the same thing. It's the risk before any controls. Whichever risk is ranked the highest is top priority. So it's pretty obvious that safety 2, with a risk value and level of 17H, if this was a live risk assessment out of those 3 safety risk assessments, S2 is top priority. Then it will be safety 1, 16 medium, and then safety 3. So that there gives me my safety profile, my risk profile. Okay. Please pause the video, ladies and gents. Just pay very close attention to how I formulated my hazards and how I formulated my risk with consequence, and also my risk evaluation. Let's take a look at 3 health examples. So again, just random selection from the activities. H1, H2, H3 are my references. Chipping, debarking, and packing. My first health hazard, excessive wood dust from the chipping process. Okay. I haven't just said wood dust. I've used words like excessive, meaning it's too much. Too much. And the reason why it's a hazard is because there's too much dust. And it's coming from the actual chipping process, or you could say the chipping machine. H2, interrupted noise at 105 audible decibels from the debarking machine during operation. You can see I haven't just said noise. Because if you're just going to word a hazard with one word, just saying noise, that is insufficient. Well, what about the noise? How much noise? Where's it coming from? We know it's coming from the debarking section, but ladies and gents, you could have multiple different activities within the debarking section. So we're actually being specific here. It's interrupted noise at 105 decibels, which is way above the 85 threshold, coming from the debarking machine. My third hazard, it's a bit of an ergonomics hazard here. Heavy rolls and stacks of finished paper in the packaging warehouse. Okay, so I've actually just included a little bit of an additional activity right at the end of the process when all the paper is finished, it's all stacked up, ready to go to the customer. So we've identified an ergonomic hazard. My risk for H1, short-term inhalation to that wood dust, resulting in or causing lung irritations. Long-term overexposure to noise, above 105 dBA, resulting in or causing NIHL. Employees constantly lifting incorrectly, causing or resulting in back aches, an ergonomic-related risk. You can see there, I haven't just said for H2, interrupted noise, 105 dBA, causing NIHL. If you're not going to be exposed to that noise, are you going to get NIHL? No, you're not. So you remember, you must always include the risk, the likelihood and or probability that harm from that hazard is going to occur. And that likelihood and probability is long-term overexposure. Okay. It's a health risk assessment. I probably forgot to mention there. So for going back to safety, you just tick the risk type, safety, safety, safety. These all three are health examples. So tick, tick, tick. And there's my evaluation there. So for the first H1, likelihood C, consequence 2. Let's go back to the 5x5. C2. C, it possibly could happen. 2, a reversible occupational illness because it is a lung irritation. C2, 8 medium. See that? 8 medium. 8 medium. My NIHL, I've evaluated as a D3. D, likely to happen when they are long-term overexposed. 3, an irreversible occupational disease because it's NIHL. D3, 17H. 17H. And then for my ergonomic-related risk, employees constantly lifting incorrectly, resulting or causing backaches. My evaluation is E2, 16 medium. E, very likely to happen. 2, irreversible occupational illness. E2, 16 medium. Again, if you look at those three health risk assessments, again, it's pretty obvious that H2, my NIHL, is my top priority. My second priority would be H3, backaches, 16 medium. And my least priority, that would still need controls, but out of these three, it's the least priority, is in fact my lung irritations, 8 medium. All right, and then just 3 examples of the environment. Again, my referencing is in correspondence to the environment, E1, E2, E3, just random selection, guys. My first environmental hazard or aspect, contaminated wastewater from the digesting process. E2, offcuts of waste paper from the slitting process. E3, toxic emissions from the chimney stacks. Remember, you may be thinking, well, Nick, where did you get all of these hazards that you formulated? Where's all this information coming from? Well, if you go back to your inputs and outputs, let's go back to this one here, E1, digesting. I've identified contaminated wastewater because if you look at one of my outputs from digesting, there, it's contaminated wastewater. So I've identified that that is a potential environmental issue, especially if we don't know what to do with the wastewater. We don't know how to handle it correctly. That is potentially going to be an environmental aspect. Okay, so I've used my outputs to generate my hazard formulations or to be able to provide me to be able to formulate my hazards. My environmental risks / impacts. E1, incorrect disposal of that contaminated wastewater down the drains, resulting in water pollution. E2, incorrect disposal of the offcuts of waste paper outside the factory, resulting in aesthetic pollution. Emissions for E3, permitted to atmosphere, resulting in air pollution. All right, so when we're looking at the environment, ladies and gents, what we're looking at here is how are we going to degrade the environment? How are we going to destroy the environment? And the definition of pollution, very important, must always tie in with the definition of pollution as per NEMA. Okay, so if you don't remember the definition of pollution, please open up your National Environmental Management Act, Section 1. Go and find the definition of pollution, read it, and understand it well. It's very, very important as an environmental risk assessor, you know that definition of pollution. These three are all environmental risk assessments. So I tick the environment type or risk type, the environment. And looking at my evaluation for E1, I've got a D2, 12 medium. So I go back to the matrix. D, likely to happen. 2, for the environment, the impact affects the work site and immediate surroundings, i.e. the neighbors. D2, 12 medium. 12 medium. I've got the same evaluation for E2, for my aesthetic pollution. D2, likely to happen. 2, the impact affects the work site and immediate surroundings, i.e. the neighbors. D2, 12 medium. Same, 12 medium. And my E3, those emissions that are being permitted to atmosphere, that's resulting in horrible air pollution. I've got an evaluation of E3. E, very likely to happen. 3, moderate. The impact affects the local area, i.e. beyond your site neighbors. It could affect the whole village, the whole town, and or the city, because these emissions are being entering or they've been allowed to interact with the atmosphere. Wind currents will push that air pollution over the surrounding area. That's why I've gone and chosen for a slightly larger area, because I'm thinking practically here as a risk assessor. So I said there, E3, 20H. You see that? And just looking at those 3 risk assessments, again, it's pretty obvious that E3, my air pollution, is my top priority. My E1 and E2 are shared equal second priority with the same value and level of 12 medium. All right. So please, ladies and gents, please just pause that video. Again, just pay attention to how I have formulated my hazards. Look at the detail that I've provided. Look at the detail of my risk with consequence. I'm sure you will agree with me that if this was your risk assessment and you gave this to your management at your workplace, your workers, they could actually extract the information from your HIRA and they are able to clearly interpret the information provided on your HIRA. All right. But again, if there's any questions, ladies and gents, please don't hesitate to post your questions on the Talent LMS forum, the discussion forum, and I will do my best to answer your question on those e-learning platforms. Okay. I just want to end off this video just to show you an example of incorrectly formulated hazards and risks. So I've just taken safety 3. So let me just go back to remind you. There's my safety 3. Hot steam from the dry rolling machine is my hazard. My risk, employees contacting that hot steam resulting in burns. Okay. So if this was a very poorly formulated hazard and risk, steam for the hazard, one word, risk, burns. What? Steam? What about the steam? Steam from where? You've indicated it's coming from the dry rolling process, but you could have multiple sources of steam. So, ladies and gents, one-worded hazards are insufficient. They are insufficient for your summative assessment, and they are insufficient for after your summative assessment back in industry. The risk, burns. How? How are your people going to get burnt? If they're not even near the steam from the dry rolling machine, how are they going to get burnt? They're not. But that's what the risk assessment says. So in this example here, we haven't identified the risk. So this would be incorrect. Same for H2. My H2 here is interrupted noise at 105 dBA from the debarking machine. My risk, long-term overexposure to that noise, resulting in NIHL. Look at the difference between that And that noise from what? How much noise? What about the noise? What about the noise for it to be a hazard? If it was very quiet, would that still be a hazard if it was very, very quiet? No, but that's what the risk assessment says. It just says noise. Okay. NIHL. How? How are your people going to suffer NIHL? So one-worded hazards, one-worded risks, ladies and gents, it is insufficient. And from an assessment point of view, you will be marked incorrect, okay, which could be costly. E2, look at my E2 here, offcuts of waste paper from the slitting process, incorrect disposal of the offcuts of waste paper outside the factory, resulting in aesthetic pollution. If you were to word it like that, offcuts of waste paper, okay, that's not too bad, but from what? From where? We know it's from the slitting process, but you could have multiple offcuts of waste paper from that process. So here you can see it's coming from the actual slitting process. The risk, aesthetic pollution. But how? How is the offcuts of waste paper resulting in aesthetic pollution? Now, you've got to be specific here, ladies and gents, by identifying the risk. So just go back to my example. The risk is the incorrect disposal of those offcuts of waste paper outside the factory, resulting in some form of pollution, such as aesthetic pollution. So that would be incorrect. Okay. So please just take this this video, ladies and gents, as a bit of a reminder, as a bit of a learning curve as to how you are going to formulate your hazards and your risks, as well with your evaluation. Now, just from an assessment point of view, if I just go back to my safety example here, what's going to happen in your SAMTRAC exam in the classroom? The assessor is going to look not only at the case study, okay, because remember your whole entire HIRA is based on the case study. The assessor is going to look at your hazard, okay, and they want to see information like this. Not word for word, but they want to see sufficient formulated hazards. They are then going to also look, before they even start awarding you a mark, they're also going to look at your risk. And your risk with consequence must be relevant to your hazard, because this shows correct risk analysis. Remember, risk analysis is phase 3 of the HIRA process. We are literally converting the hazard into the risk with consequence. And provided the hazard and risk with consequence is sufficient, the assessor is going to award you, I'll just put a little green tick here, will award you 1 mark for both. The assessor is then also going to look at your risk evaluation. Now, there is a bit of discretion exercise here, guys, because remember, it's a fictitious case study. It's a training exercise. You know, obviously it's being pulled into your exam, but we don't have any statistics to work on. So the assessor will exercise a lot of discretion, especially with the likelihood, because we actually don't know how often, you know, people are handling these blades, getting cut. We don't have those statistics in front of us. But the assessor is really going to look at your consequence. And this is when you can go a little bit wrong in your consequence evaluation. For example, for safety 1, you see my evaluation, my risk here is handling those blades causing cuts. If I were to put my consequence, let's say, as a 5 catastrophic multiple fatalities, so instead of saying 2, I said 5, that's wrong. That's incorrect. Because I said in my risk assessment, cuts. But now you are evaluating fatalities. But I didn't say anyone's going to die. I just said people are going to get cut. So that's when you can go a little bit wrong with your consequence evaluation. So just pay very close attention during your exam on risk evaluation for consequence. Okay. All right, so let's just go back here. So once the assessor is satisfied that the likelihood and the consequence are realistic, and the risk value and risk level have been, you know, correctly intercepted or intersected with each other, you will then be awarded another mark. So another tick there. So in total, your mark allocation for each risk assessment will be a maximum of 2 marks. Now, if you go wrong, let's just delete these green ticks. Let's say your hazard is incorrect. The assessor is not even going to look at the rest of the information. If your hazard, ladies and gents, is incorrect, the whole entire risk assessment will be awarded 0 marks. Okay. Let's now say your hazard is correct. Your hazard's correct, but your risk with consequence is incorrect. Again, the assessor is going to award you 0 marks. All right, so please take your time during your exam to carefully formulate your hazard with your risk with consequence. Take your time, don't rush. If you're going to produce risk assessments, let's go back to that example of a very poorly formulated risk assessment, this one here. If you were to produce this, the soundtrack assessor is just going to give you 0, 0, 0. Okay, because this is insufficient. All right. I'm hoping this little tutorial video will assist you and provide you a little bit more clearer. Please stay tuned, ladies and gents, because the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the management plan, the HSE management plan. All right, so stay tuned and please watch this second video. We'll see you then. All right. Thanks, guys. I'll see you shortly.